Welcome to The Current Potential, the podcast where healing, aligned living, and intention meet the deeper current of who we are. I'm your host, Melissa Curtin. Here we explore holistic health, mind, body, heart wisdom, empowering stories, and what's current in natural healing, all to help you reconnect with your own inner current and potential. Welcome to this episode of The Current Potential. I'm your host, Melissa Curtin. For this episode, it is my honor to sit down with Stefanie Bennett, who has a PhD in Transpersonal Psychology, and she's started to integrate Aramaic mysticism with spiritual science. Thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation.
It's really my pleasure to be here. And it's episode number 9, which is a great omen number for me.
Wonderful. So if you can, please share a little bit about your background, the history of what you did for work, and how you landed where you are now in your professional journey.
Great. That's a great question. So I have always wanted to go into psychology, and I applied to be a grad student to go into a Jungian psychology program, and I got denied. So while I was disappointed at first, I thought, okay, life is taking me a different direction. And many years later, I found transpersonal psychology and realized why that other program I was rejected from. So I really definitely knew I was on the right path. And it's because transpersonal psychology is really a spiritual psychology. It looks at the whole human being, the body, mind, the soul, and then also the spirit. So all the way across the human, it's framed a completely different way than your traditional psychology model. So once I graduated, I moved into working with women who had suffered from parental alienation. So in some way, shape, or form, they were alienated from their children. And it is a unique situation that not everybody really understands the full dynamic of. But my dissertation study was on this subject matter, in particular on mothers. So there wasn't really any literature in the research that was studying mothers who had lost access. Most of the literature was on the children, and then the second category was on fathers who had lost access. So my study was actually the first of its kind, and I really wanted to follow up with people because as a mother, there is a unique bond between mother and child. The wound that occurs in parental alienation with a mother is fundamentally devastating because of the mother-child bond that is, a fundamental outgrowth of, your human nature. So it was really important to me to study this and to add to the literature.
Okay, amazing. One question that comes to mind now, were these related to more legal cases where a parent takes a child away from the other parent, or was this more elective where children are choosing not to have a relationship with that parent? Because I've heard that term in both of those contexts.
So for my study, I had qualifications, and part of the qualifications were they needed to be inside of the court system, the family court system. So there was legal framework to the actual issue.
Okay. Thank you. That makes sense.
Well, basically, I was studying trauma. So my background is in trauma studies. And what I ended up I got into narcissism research and working with people who had suffered from narcissism because I was personally introduced to it in my personal life. And I was really struggling with how to explain to myself what just happened to me. And that's partially because I had a previous experience with a narcissist. But what I didn't understand at the time was that there are different faces of narcissism. So just because you have encountered one type of narcissism doesn't mean you will recognize the second type. So part of what I'm trying to do is really educate people on what does narcissism look like? How does it present so that you can recognize these red flags when they're coming in real time, and preferably not too far after, because covert narcissism is much more difficult to identify and it is far more insipid and it's more dangerous. So this is the kind of narcissism that usually takes people quite some time to really, they know something's wrong, but they can't really identify what it is. So it takes longer to wake up to it. And by that time, you're really already entrenched. So my scope of practice has really begun to move from parental alienation into the broader framework of trauma, and it encapsulates and incorporates narcissism. So really, my fundamental research background is in understanding trauma and how the human being heals from it.
Okay. That's fascinating. And I know the term narcissism gets thrown around a lot in different circles across the board, from psychology to spiritual circles, relationships, different, marriage counselors and everything. What are the traits of the covert narcissism that separates that from like what someone would perceive as traditional narcissism?
Well, there are 6 traits to narcissism in general, but I want to really explain what the different kinds of narcissism are so that people can learn to identify. So before we go into the traits, I will explain the different types. So there is overt narcissism, which is the grandiose style. They are the ones who are braggadocious. They're really loud. They are the center of attention. They maintain that center of attention. They're really driven by having all eyes on them. And then there is the covert narcissist or the vulnerable narcissist, and they are generally more soft-spoken. They don't demand attention. They're quieter in the way that they garner their supply, and they're much more harder to identify because they are so quiet. Then you have subtypes, which is you have a cerebral narcissist, and they're going to garner supply by showing you how smart they are. They're the smartest person in the room. They're the smartest person ever. They really rely on their cerebral capacity in order to garner their supply. Then you have a somatic narcissist, which they're garnering their supply through their body, through their home, through their car, through physical things that they're obtaining supply from. So what most people don't know is that there is no type constancy in narcissism. So just because I met a narcissist and he was in a cerebral state doesn't mean that somebody he dated 5 years ago didn't know him as a completely different type of person because he was in a somatic stage. So what happens in the cycle of narcissism is that the narcissist, when they're in their stage of getting supply, they are type constant. And then when the supply drops, leaves them, the relationship breaks up, they generally go into a depression, which is often misdiagnosed as manic depressive, bipolar, because they will remain quiet for some time. And what they're doing psychologically is they're working up their energy again to basically go out and become a hunter again. And when they reemerge as the opposite type. So they will present in a completely different way as a somatic if they were a cerebral, and vice versa. So these people are often misdiagnosed as manic depressive, but they're actually not. So I really think it's important for people to understand these differences, because it is so important to learn to identify the red flags so that you can save yourself. We are in an epidemic of narcissism right now. So many people are encountering narcissists in one way, shape, or form. And then I think it's important to add a caveat there that there are people with narcissistic traits, and then there are people who have the full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. Mm-hmm. These characteristics that I'm going to explain are things to identify. And this is absolutely important to have a psychologist diagnose this type of a thing. There is a lot of self-styled narcissism specialists right now, like especially in the TikTok venue. And it's really important to be cautious about what it is they're talking about, because oftentimes they're not as well informed as they could be. I think they are helping people, but it's really important to understand the difference between people who have narcissistic traits and somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, which is a diagnosis out of the DSM, and it is categorized as a cluster B, which is a mental illness. So I think it's really important for people to really wrap their arms around the idea that these people are mentally ill. And if you've ever dealt with one, you will believe that statement, because you will just really believe that statement.
Yeah. So this is all fascinating to me.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So 1, narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a constant need for admiration, and a profound lack of empathy. So key traits include an inflated sense of self-importance, entitlement, exploitive behavior, and arrogance. So they often have haughty or arrogant attitudes, and oftentimes this is missed to a large degree. They're jealous of other people, or they think other people are jealous of them for whatever reason. So it always manifests like that.
And those are just the traits, not someone who has the full-blown disorder?
No, those are the traits of narcissism personality disorder.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure.
Yeah. So if you want to talk about more generally people with narcissism, it's really this haughty, arrogant attitude and grandiosity and this sense of entitlement. Those are three mainstays.
Okay. All right. Can you share how your educational background ties into your personal story and areas of interest? Did one inspire the other, or was this all happening parallel to your studies and your career evolvement?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was an interesting track because I always wanted to be a doctor of the soul. So psychology was always something that I was interested in. However, my personal life shaped the scope of what I ended up studying for my dissertation and then also getting into the work on narcissism. So they really did end up kind of fueling each other. But I was really grateful for the fact that my degree gave me a means to explore what was happening in my personal life. And it is my attitude that when terrible things happen to you in your life, it is an invitation to get to the other side of it. And that is exactly what this work has done for me. And my PhD has just basically given me an outlet to, work on research and offer my work to the world through something that is easily recognized in the general world.
Yes, thank you. And then what drew you to pursue that particular PhD in transpersonal psychology from the school that you attended?
Mm-hmm. So the school that I attended is called Sophia University, and it is a consciousness studies based program. And that appealed to me because I didn't really believe in the traditional model of psychology where you learn a behavioralist model for the most part, and you work your way through the system with a license that they give to you. That modality didn't really resonate with me. I wanted to have more freedom to work with people and to not only work with diagnoses, but with processes that the human is going through. I really don't believe in researching and working with people's behaviors as a means to understanding what's going on with their psychology. So I was more drawn to like a Jungian perspective. This degree actually gave me the freedom that I needed to actually study the things that I wanted to study because I've always wanted to incorporate spirituality in my work. The human being has a spiritual architecture, and in order to understand the full experience of the human being, you need to take that into consideration. And that is not something that you can generally do operating inside of the traditional system with a license.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. Can you share for the listeners what Carl Jung and the Jungian psychology brings to that field?
Mm-hmm. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist, and he was in opposition to Freud at the time. They were practicing at the same time. So Carl Jung's approach to the human being is looking at more of a spiritual framework and looking at the collective unconscious. So he looks at the human as not only having his individuality, but as participating in archetypes through this collective unconscious. So it is a much more broad way of looking at the human being and treating the human being. This scope of looking at the human is what appealed to me, but since I have grown in my reading, I have an even broader framework for understanding the human being now.
Thank you. So this deep transformational work that you've studied and you're working with others includes this concept from wound to crown. Can you explain more about what the wound is and the arc and that hero's journey?
Yes. So I coined this term because I felt like this encapsulates the idea of what my body of work can help somebody do. So we all have suffering. That is the one universal thing that we all have in common. So we've all suffered something. It doesn't matter what it is. The question is, can you take a look at the wound and see the gift? If you can take it to the other side, if you can get to the other side of this wound, you will uncover the gift. And so this transformation of getting from the wound to the crown is the hero or the heroine's journey. And it really involves transmutation, transformation, and reintegration of your wounds. So it's the full scope of the journey. And this is the journey that we all share. I take the approach that if you can look at your wound like it is an initiation, it is there to test you in whatever it is that your soul needs strengthening in. It's a gift. And if we can look at it that way, it will offer itself to us and open itself to us and show us what gift we will adopt by transmuting it inside of our soul.
Absolutely. That resonates with me. I think in an earlier conversation, it was the same during my massive awakening and wake up call. I was already on a spiritual path, so I knew that this happened to teach me to offer something, and deciphering and kind of like decoding my experience to determine what that was through a long process of healing, of course, but knew that it was there for my healing, for my discovery, for my purpose to kind of bring me deeper on my journey. So that resonates with me from a different angle. Can you speak about these initiation points that you just alluded to?
So, for example, if you were traumatized as a child, you suffered from child abuse, that is your entrance to your initiation. If you went through a horrific divorce and there was tremendous wounding or trauma there, that is your initiation entry point. Or if you suffered some kind of catastrophic loss, you lost a parent, you lost a beloved, you lost a child, that is your initiation point. So it doesn't matter really what happens to you, that is the place where you begin. You begin where you are, always.
Okay. So in these instances of trauma and the wounds and the suffering, does this affect the soul and cause the soul fragmentation?
So I have identified 5 different types of soul fragmentation. And it's really important for people to understand which type or types they're actually suffering from, because if you know what type you are suffering from, there are different remedies. And I go through all of this in my book, The Soul's Return. Types of soul fragmentation are a temporal fragmentation. This is basically the soul becomes stuck in a specific moment in time. And I'll just go through these briefly. The second is relational fragmentation. This is where your soul is broken into pieces and you show up as this person when you're with that person. You show up as this person with that person. So you're kind of fragmented into different compartments of your personality. Then there's energetic dispersal. So the soul's light has been scattered across, dimensions and, past relationships, old homes, past objects that you've had in your life, and you become fragmented through this dispersal. Number 4 is identity splintering. This person no longer recognizes who they actually are. So their sense of identity has been hollowed out or overwritten by the narcissist's projections. They may adopt masks or personas or roles that serve for their survival. The 5th kind is shadow binding, and this is pretty severe. So certain aspects of the soul become bound in shame, fear, or self-hatred, and they're exiled to the unconscious. So you're really sort of a lost soul at that point. These are often powerful or luminous aspects of the self, such as rage or anger, eroticism, intuition, or even spiritual insight that the abuser cannot tolerate. So you basically go into hiding here. So in this type of soul fragmentation, the soul is not only scattered, but it is actually bound. So this is the most severe form of fragmentation. So most people are suffering from a couple different kinds at the same time. They're not generally suffering from one. It depends if they have trauma, complex trauma. So it kind of depends on how much trauma has compiled on top of itself.
And I would guess that we don't just get one situation. There's multi-layers that you need to unravel, like a sweater,
Yeah, exactly.
How does soul fragmentation affect and connect to one's health?
So there is a direct correlation. Oftentimes what happens in soul fragmentation is it becomes so severe that the mast cells in the human being are inflamed, and it causes the etheric sheath to weaken, and it makes the person more prone to different types of infections or weaknesses in the physical body. And oftentimes too, it will start to affect the chakra system. And when the chakras are weakened and they're not spinning in the correct speed and direction, it will directly affect the person's health. And also it can start to affect the person's energy level. They don't know who they are anymore. They don't know what they want anymore. They really start to lose contact with themselves. So they not only physically suffer, but they also psychologically suffer. It just depends on where on the spectrum they are in terms of the fragmentation. There is a life cycle to each type of soul fragmentation, is what I'm saying.
That is really fascinating. Can you provide examples of what kinds of trauma contribute to soul fragmentation?
I mean, honestly, it can be anything. In my book, I'm talking specifically about narcissistic abuse, but
Okay.
there's anything that causes a shock to the person can cause soul fragmentation.
Now, how can someone recover from trauma other than talk therapy and psychotherapy? Like, what is most needed and useful?
hmm So in my framework, how I talk about it is the person's spiritual architecture, the subtle bodies need to be integrated with one another. They need to nest inside of one another like Russian dolls, and they need to be integrated with the chakra system and within themselves. So if the person is integrated, they will experience health. But it's when the bodies are not integrated and the chakras aren't spinning correctly that the person experiences ill health, whether it's physical or emotional, mental, or psychological, or even spiritual.
Okay. And for listeners that are new on their journey and may not know what chakras are, I mean, I understand them as the energy systems in different parts of the body. Can you elaborate a little bit on that to make it clear?
So the chakra system, it depends on which system you're talking about, but for the most part, there are 7 accepted chakras that are the most basic, and they are centered from the root all the way to the crown in the human being, and they spin in a certain direction and they spin at a certain speed. They need to be in alignment with each other, and they're in different parts of the human body correlated to organ systems, and they each have a color that they're correlated to. And so oftentimes if you're psychic, you can see the person's chakra system. Like say, for example, the solar plexus should be a bright, beautiful yellow. It turns muddy after somebody has undergone, trauma or narcissistic abuse.
hmm And then can we just name them?
The chakra system will begin at the bottom, which is the root chakra. Then you have the sacral chakra, the solar plexus, the heart chakra, the throat chakra, and the crown chakra.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So how does someone integrate those 4 layers of their being? You referenced the subtle, the etheric, the astral, and the physical. How does that become integrated in this healing process from your approach?
So throughout my book, The Soul's Return, I have woven in different exercises that are either journaling exercises, affirmations, mantras, prayers, written exercises that you can do as you read the book that will help you reintegrate. So by the time you finish reading the book, you've done a lot of these exercises, and I can give some of these examples. And then I've also written a workbook that goes with The Soul's Return. So if you want a little bit more work or you feel like you need a little bit more that you want to work on, you can add that in with the regular book too. So these are ways that you can start to work with your subtle bodies. The basic idea here behind trauma integration is Bessel van der Kolk did a beautiful book called The Body Keeps the Score. And the main idea that shows up over and over again in the research is that when the human being is engaged with an activity where they are inside of their eye, which is, what do you love to do? Is it painting? Is it running? Is it yoga? Is it songwriting? It doesn't matter what it is, but what are you doing when you feel most like yourself? That is when you really start to reintegrate these traumas. So that's the main idea. So then there's different exercises that I have built that kind of help you do that.
Okay. And I'll be sure in the show notes to put a link to your book and the workbook. So whoever wants to dig a little deeper on that, they can find that easily. Your work also includes anthroposophy. Can you share what this is and its origin?
So anthroposophy is a spiritual science that was developed by Austrian philosopher Dr. Rudolf Steiner at the turn of the century. Well, he started in the 1800s and then ended, I think, around 1925. So his entire philosophy is based on this idea of human freedom. And what does that mean for the individual? He was a scientist. Basically, Rudolf Steiner developed a philosophy of freedom and what that meant to the human being from extremely scientific framework. He was a scientist before he was a philosopher. And so he wanted to develop a system that helped people understand spirituality in a scientific way that helps complement medical science, helps complement spirituality. I mean, he was a polymath. So he created art form called eurythmy, which is movement. He created medicine. He was an architect. He wrote philosophy. I mean, he wrote over, I think, 40 books and over 6,000 lectures that he delivered. It was really important to him to create something that people could engage with to understand their spirituality, but it needed to be scientific.
Did he do that as a way to kind of ground what he was saying and make it more widely acceptable? When you say, like, when I think of like scientific, it's like, okay, so people can understand from the scientific viewpoint.
Well, from his standpoint, he started in theosophy, and theosophy was somewhat theoretical, I guess you could say. So it was important to him to couch his methodology in something that was scientific and people could actually point to the science of it, and to say that its methodology and its outcomes were substantiated because they were so scientific.
Okay. And when I think of scientific, I think of reproducible.
Yes. So what's interesting about his work now, 100 years later, is that there are research projects that are incorporating his concepts, trying to create replicatable scientific experiments. And it's actually really interesting science. He created the foundation stone that people are now building on 100 years later.
Can you share more about anthroposophy? If you heal the physical ailment, then you heal the psych illness.
In anthroposophical medicine, when somebody presents with a physical malady, they are treated through their psychology. If somebody presents with a psychological malady, they're treated through their physicality. And this is generally their approach. And when it's approached this way, they have so much success of people actually resolving these issues. It's just a matter of, where do you begin? Where do you find your opening to treat whatever it is that the person is suffering from?
Is this just a more specific way of looking at the mind, body, spirit? So you were saying, like, you heal the physical and there's a psychological connection to that physical issue.
Yes. So it is an anthroposophical medicine approach. I don't know if other people have that approach. I only know about it through studying anthroposophical medicine.
Okay. Yeah. And I think German New Medicine touches on that a little bit. And then there's some other, like Louise L. Hay would speak about that. And actually, you mentioned The Body Keeps Score, but there's another book that I referred to in another episode called Messages from the Body by Dr. Michael Lincoln, and it's a really thick book, and he outlines, I mean, he goes down to like the top index finger, left hand, this is what it could mean. I mean, it's a very, very intricate book. It's challenging to get, but he goes through, I mean, even like cellulite on the back of the right leg, what are some meanings behind that? So, and there's some psychological aspects to that. So anyway, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating.
So your work includes examining through the Aramaic lens. Can you share more about your perspective and the knowledge of Aramaic? Like, what is its origin and relevance to religion and spirituality and healing? Because healing can be for some people a religious experience, a spiritual experience. How does that Aramaic lens weave itself through health and healing?
Mm-hmm. So I've been studying Aramaic for over 10 years, and it was recently, less than a year ago, that I really had an aha moment with it. So I understood that the narcissist, from an Aramaic standpoint, is a person who is divided from their own breath. And when I realized that, it sent me down a whole new track of research. So I wrote a second book where I was integrating Aramaic mysticism with spiritual science as a way to understand what is going on with the narcissist. Why are they divided from their breath, and what are the outcomes of that? How can we better understand what a narcissist is experiencing inside of their soul life from an Aramaic lens? Aramaic is the language that Christ spoke, and it was the lingua franca at the time. It comes later than Hebrew, and not many people know this. There are not that many books that are with us now that were written in Aramaic. The tradition at the time was to really burn the books that were written in Aramaic because they were held by families, and they held these for generation after generation after generation. And when they wrote down the new book out of the old one, they burned the old one. So there's not that much that is left with us. So we have certain books that were found at St. Catherine's Monastery, and some some at Nag Hammadi, but there are very few books that were actually written in Aramaic. What's important about understanding this is that when you take an Aramaic text and you filter it through Greek, it loses its meaning because the Greek is dualistic. It separates the mind from the body, and Aramaic is a holistic. It looks at the human being as having the inside and the outside unseparate. Me and you, we are not separate. There is only one preposition, so there really isn't a difference between inside and outside. So, for example, the word in Aramaic that we translate as God is Allah, and what it actually means is God is very abstract. So the Aramaic is far more meaningful in the sense that Allah means the field, the one true reality, the great cosmic beginning before the beginnings. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can translate what Allah means. It's really endless. There is no one correct way to translate any one Aramaic word. So it really opens up a cohesive way to look at reality, really, let alone the human being. But there is a cohesiveness and integration and a cosmic unity amongst human beings and amongst the entire creation that comes through an Aramaic lens. So oftentimes, for example, if you want to look at the word that means, we're told that it means good or bad out of the Bible, the word is really meaning ripe, and the word is tuv, and it means ripe. Are you underripe, or are you overripe, or are you ripe? There is no moralism here. There's no good and bad. It's really about how ripe are you and where are you in the ripening process. So it takes this whole, hierarchical look of I'm the church father and I'm telling you that you're bad or you're good, and it removes it from the paradigm. The paradigm is not built like that at all. It's built on where are you inside of yourself in relationship to Allah in your ripening.
That's beautiful. And then at the same time, you think about how many different variations and translations over the years have occurred. What are some examples of what was spoken and written in Aramaic in the original text that would be meaningful to understand from the original message to how we're using it now, if you could break that down?
One of the words that comes through the Gospels that is written in Aramaic is when Christ was working with Lazarus, and we're told that he said to Lazarus, "Rise up." The word is ephata, and what it means is be open. And this idea of ephata is what I think Aramaic does for the human being when we hear it. The language has a spiritual architecture that is written into it. It can house spiritual concepts by the very nature of the way that the language is built. Each word is built on trilateral root system. When they don't look at these three letters as letters, they look at them as being. So when you're constructing a word, you're actually working with beings that come through with these spiritual concepts through the language. So for example, the word malkuta, which is translated in the New Testament as kingdom, the kingdom of God is within you. The word is malkuta. And if you wanted to translate this as queendom, you could, because it's a feminine gendered word. However, this is a feudalistic concept, and Aramaic predates kings and queens. So if you really wanted to get to the heart of what this word means, it means the I can energy of the universe. So when we're in that flow state, we all naturally inhabit this idea that we can do anything because we're in the flow of having energy coming through us. And we have that feeling of, I could do anything right now, feeling like this. That word really encapsulates what this idea that Christ is telling us. He's telling us that the Malkuta is within us. We are each capable of reaching this energy so that we can participate in the flow of Allah. This is a completely different way of looking at what he's telling us. It's not a kingdom where there's a Papa God sitting on a throne somewhere. This is an active participatory act that we are actively engaged in this flow state because we have reached that place within us that is, what we call God or the Christ or the flow state.
Mm-hmm. Just listening to you, and I wonder, God, about how that just affects people's interpretation and their life. A lot of people live by the Bible and what it exactly says, but they don't know what that language was before.
Well, it's interesting because when I talk to people about Aramaic, most people have no idea that it was the language that was spoken at the time. And most people spoke Aramaic. When Christ was speaking to people, he was mostly speaking to really very poor, impoverished people, and they spoke Aramaic. So he wasn't speaking Hebrew to them, and he certainly wasn't speaking Greek to them. Those were the languages of the bureaucrats. And so he had to speak to them in a language that they understood, and it was Aramaic.
Mm-hmm.
In Aramaic, there is a word called sharara, and what it means is returning back into your right rhythm and your right breath. In Aramaic, the word ruha means breath, and it also means spirit. So if you'd return back into your right rhythm and your right spirit, you are integrated. And so when this word that we're told means sin is some kind of moralistic framework of we're good or we're bad, the word doesn't mean that at all. It really means, can you move back into your right rhythm? You need to turn back into your integrated self so that your subtle bodies are all integrated and you're nesting like a Russian doll within all of your bodies. So it really changes the way that we think about that word sin.
Yeah. Was there anything else that you wanted to add about the Aramaic and the language? And one thing that came up was the frequency aspect of that language that you and I talked about before this interview. Can you expand on that?
Yes. So Rudolf Steiner said that Aramaic was the only language that Christ could have incarnated into in order to speak the truths that he came to expound upon and teach us. I also want to point out that this is also the language that Mary Magdalene spoke. And so there are ideas that these two people spoke that could not have been presented through any other language. And that is because the spiritual architecture of Aramaic can house these ideas, and also the frequency of the language is of a particular frequency, and it is healing to hear it. Anybody who listens to Aramaic experiences what this language can do. What's interesting from my perspective about the Aramaic that was spoken at the time of Christ is that, according to spiritual science, at that time, the human being had not received its human I, the higher self, yet. That is what the mission of Christ was, is to bring the ego or the human I to the human being. So when people were listening to the language back then, they were listening to it as not having their human I. Now, when we hear this language, and I believe that when I speak to people about it, I can see that it brings something to life in people. And I believe it's because of the epigenetics of hearing this language throughout time. And then also, we're now hearing this language with the human I, with the ego inside of our spiritual architecture. And it's being received in a different way that it could not have been received before when the human did not have the I.
So interesting to me on so many levels. And I know I keep saying that same word, but it's all new, I think, to me. In looping back to our discussion about narcissism and how they are disconnected from their own breath, that's what you said earlier. Have you found in your research a lot of narcissists probably have a lot of soul fragmentation and trauma themselves?
So what's interesting about people who are suffering from narcissism is that they're some of the saddest people that you would ever want to know. And this is because they're not connected to their higher self. They're completely divorced. So narcissism works on a spectrum. So when you're in a narcissistic personality disordered state, you are completely divided from your higher self. This is why they present as not having any empathy. If you are disconnected from your I, your higher self, you will not demonstrate empathy. You're incapable of showing it. You don't feel it. You're not connected. Human beings are naturally connected to empathy, but these people are disconnected from that part of themselves, and therefore they're going to present this way. So these people are divided from the fullness of their breath. There is a part of themselves, which is their higher self, it's not connected to their breath or their spirit. They are literally people divided.
Interesting. But there's other ways that presents. Someone can be disconnected from their higher self, but not have narcissism for other reasons.
Well, that's a little bit more complicated. So, in a spiritual science standpoint, depending on where you are disconnected from yourself. So, for example, I am in the process of writing a new book called Breath Remembered. And what I'm doing is I'm writing a spiritual anthropology of psychological illnesses. The hypothesis of this book is that depending on where the person is disconnected from their breath, which organ system, where in their subtle bodies, and the various combinations of that, they will present with particular psychological illnesses. So for example, if your liver is in an imbalanced state, you will have hallucinations. This book really goes into diagnosing where exactly in the human spiritual architecture the breath is not reaching, and what is the correlated psychological ailment that comes from it. And based on where the breath is not reaching in the circulation process, how do you bring breath back to this place in order to resolve the psychological illness?
That is very fascinating to me, and I look forward to. When would that book come out? Within a year?
Within the year, yes. And I'm planning on I'm actually building a research study to do a pilot study on that hypothesis in terms of depression. And it's going to be a pilot study. There will only be about 9 or 10 different participants. And so if anybody is interested in working with me on that, I would be open to hearing from them.
Great. When you were just talking about the new book that you are in the process of writing, can you share a bit more about what you're offering now and who your work would be ideal for?
hmm So I typically work with women who have suffered some kind of trauma, especially narcissistic abuse or parental alienation. They've tried therapy, they've read the books, they've done the things, and they're still just not quite all the way home. This is where I really can specialize in and help people get all the way home, because psychology can reach the mind, but narcissistic abuse is a spiritual violation. It is spiritual warfare, and we need to address the wounds of the soul in order to really reintegrate the person. So then I also offer a 12-week program that is called The Soul's Return, and we go through the entire healing modalities that my book really speaks to, so that people can actually do the work, meet once a week with me, and we go through all of the exercises together. They can talk about whatever's on their mind and really try to work through these things. Another thing that I do that's kind of interesting, whenever I start working with somebody, I do what's called the soul map. So it's like human design, but it's different because human design looks at you in this particular moment in time. My soul maps look at your karma, your strengths, your weaknesses, and really what you're here to do. So before I start working with anybody, this is what I do for people. But sometimes people just want to buy these soul maps a la carte because it's so interesting. They get to see, where they're at and where they're going and where they've been. So it's kind of a full picture. And then all of my books are available on Amazon.
Okay. And you have them on your website as well?
Yes, I do.
Okay, wonderful. So Stefanie, why do you do what you do?
So I have this undying belief that every single human being has the capacity to transform themselves into who they came here to be, which is the best version of them, and to flourish in joy, in peace, in glory, in beauty.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's very touching. I mean, why not, right? That's our birthright.
That is our birthright. Everything else is a lie.
Yes.
One of my favorite sayings is, "That which wounds us also anoints us. For every distortion bears within it the hidden blueprint of return."
How beautiful. Thank you. Where can someone learn more about what you offer and explore working with you?
So my website is Dr. Stefanie Bennett, and it's Stefanie with an F. So all of my opportunities to work with me are on there. I have my books on there, and I also have a host of products that I've created, like Mary Magdalene journals and ebooks that I've written, workbooks that I've written. There is so much that I offer on there. Whether you want to work directly with me or not, there's something for everyone.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being my guest today, and I love the wisdom that you shared with me and the listeners. Do you have anything else to add?
I am just so grateful for this opportunity. I think that it's a remarkable thing that so many people are creating their own podcast and really utilizing their voice and sending it out over the airwaves. So I appreciate being invited to your stream into the world.
Thank you. It's, just another voice in the ethers here, right?
Yeah.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode From Wound to Crown with Stefanie Bennett. Thank you for tuning into the Current Potential podcast. If this conversation resonated, inspired your next step, or you know someone this episode can benefit, please share, subscribe, and find me on Instagram at The Current Potential for new episodes and related content, and on my website, melissacurtin.com. Until next time, be aligned, stay connected to your inner wisdom, and follow the current that supports your potential.